Cristo ricorda me quando vengas e tu reino. Cristo ricorda me quando vengas e tu reino. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. These were the words that I was singing and leading a group of worshipers at a prayer service for the sanctuary movement at the Fox Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship this summer. There was a family who had chosen to seek sanctuary with the congregation, not so much to live there, but to ask for help, both with rides down to Milwaukee for their ICE hearings and just legal support. And the family ended up the father was going to be deported after all, and so they wanted us to have a prayer service, and so it was both in Spanish and English. And during the height of the prayer service, I chose to have essentially a laying out of hands. The family came forward. It was a mother and father that were probably, I'm guessing, in their early 50s, and a son and daughter that were in their 20s somewhere, and the daughter was married and had a grandchild. And so the whole family was there, and we all touched them somehow. I had my hands on them, and someone was touching me, so the whole room was connected. And we had a prayer and a blessing over them. And I'll never forget, my hand was on the back of the 20-something's son's on his back. And while I was saying the prayer, he was just shaking. And it was, for me, a very intense moment and very, very sad, because it made me just really question, what was I doing there? What was this all about? I mean, this is a family that came from Mexico. I don't know all the details and all the dates, but it was about 20 years ago. Some of their kids are dreamers, so that they can stay legally for now. I think some were born here. They've lived in Menasha for 20 years-ish. The father has a job somewhere. They go to the Catholic Church. By all outward signs, they look like every middle-class American family, except for one, they're undocumented. And so it just seemed crazy to me. I looked at what was about to happen, that the oldest son had already been deported. I didn't find this out until after the service. And now the father, the ICE had found him and decided to deport him, but his wife was still here and she's undocumented. And so they were just splitting up this family. And the congregation in Appleton was hopeful. They often, undocumented immigrants get deported because they don't make their court dates. Well, you can imagine if you don't have a lot of means and transportation, to get to a court date in Milwaukee from Appleton is a little tough. So congregation members were taking him down there, going to hearings, helping with free legal support, and they thought it was going to be okay. And then at the last hearing, they said, nope, he's got to go, and this is the date he has to be deported. And oh, by the way, we're going to put him in jail until then. And so the congregation stepped in and said, look, we'll vouch for him, that he's not a flight risk. In fact, we'll buy the plane ticket for him to leave on this Sunday morning. And so that's what unfolded. He still had to wear an ankle bracelet like a criminal, but he was able to live with his family for the remaining couple of weeks, and then this was the Saturday before they needed to go down to Chicago on Sunday. And so what was the point of this to me? Here's people who are working, paying taxes they'll never get, going to church, raising this family, having these grandkids. This made no sense whatsoever. And I was wondering, what can be done about it? Well, the opening that I was singing and reading to them was their theology. It was praying for Jesus to remember you when his kingdom finally arrives. And I thought that, well, that's fine when you're a population that has no power in this society, that you hope that at least Jesus, when his kingdom comes, will remember you and save you. But that isn't a Unitarian Universalist theology typically. And so I just had all this anger inside of me, and I wanted to know more about what we could do about it. So I went out to the UUA website, the Unitarian Universalist Association website, and there's a whole section on immigration reform, and there's all different things that they're doing. But the sanctuary movement, my theme this month is sanctuary, so I focused on the new sanctuary movement. And this is the Sanctuary Movement Pledge. Now, it was put up on there over a year ago, and you'll see why in a second. Quote, "As people of faith and people of conscience, we pledge to resist the newly elected administration's policy proposals to target and deport millions of undocumented immigrants and discriminate against marginalized communities. We will open up our congregations and communities as sanctuary spaces for those targeted by hate and work alongside our friends, families, and neighbors to ensure the dignity and human rights of all people." Unquote. So when this happened, there was a group of longtime members in the Appleton Fellowship whose parents were active in the sanctuary movement in the 80s. The Appleton congregation actually housed someone fleeing from El Salvador, a couple I think it was, for about a month on their way to Canada back in the 80s. Well, this was now the daughter of one of the couples that were leading that, was really fired up about this and got a sanctuary movement going again in the Appleton congregation, and actually was partnering with the Quakers. And the Quakers really wanted to do something about it, but the Quakers are a very small group in Appleton. They just meet in each other's homes. They didn't have the space for this. They were willing to loan out a bedroom or something, but so there's not a lot of real clear laws around sanctuary. It's more of a tradition than a legal status. And frankly, they felt that it wouldn't be respected if it was in someone's house. It needed to be in a building that was clearly a church or that kind of a worship structure. So together, they put together a program in the Appleton congregation. And at the annual meeting, they voted on it. Now, technically, they didn't have to. They had voted in the 80s to become a sanctuary congregation. But the congregation at that time had about 70 members, and now it has 700. So they decided that maybe they should recommit and make sure that everybody's involved. And it passed unanimously, and they had a huge fundraiser for it as well. So what they did is they basically got prepared. They have free legal status that I referred to earlier, and they have volunteers ready at a moment's notice to do something. And everybody knows what they're supposed to do. They took one of the religious education classrooms, and if they need to, it can convert to a bedroom. And they put locks on it so you can actually lock someone out if you need to, technically ICE agents. And actually at our last staff meeting, we went through what do you do if they show up at the door? How are you going to function? You know, and checking to make sure that, because there was just recently some ICE raids in schools and factories in Appleton, and what I've heard is they weren't done with a warrant. They just show up and look, you know, official, and away they go. So we had a lot of training on what to do with that. They also converted a janitor closet into a shower. So we have the means to have a family stay, and there's shower, and obviously there's a kitchen. But the thing of it is, so the Quakers and a lot of other people are doing support, because if we have a family come, you need someone to be there 24/7. And so people need to commit to be there around the clock, because you never know when someone's going to be knocking on the door. So that's really how the Quakers have decided to get involved, plus they did a lot of bedding and supplies and things like that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. What does a sanctuary movement look like? And you've got one just about 40 miles up the road, and all the preparation. And if you so choose, it could be something that we could get involved in here. So after looking at what the Appleton congregation has done and all of the things that are out there to get engaged in this, it made me step back a second. And it made me think of that parables of babies in the river. It sounds really gross, but I don't know if you know that parable, but it's this parable where supposedly a village was alongside a river, and they were minding their own business, and somebody noticed that there was a baby floating down the river crying, and somebody waded in and grabbed the baby, and while they were doing that, they realized there was another one coming downstream. And it turns out that this seemed to be a trend, and there were more and more babies floating down the river. And so the village decided they needed to do something. So they got together foster parents and kind of built an orphanage, and they even built watchtowers on both sides of the river with lights at nighttime so that they could see all these babies that were coming. But they never thought about, well, why are the babies in the river in the first place? And somebody in the village suggested that, and it broke into this huge argument about should we waste resources and time to wander upstream to figure out who's throwing babies in the river when we've got a lot to take care of right here and just taking care of the babies. So it's kind of this weird parable that's kind of famous. But it talks about, well, yeah, you can take care of the issues. You can build a sanctuary in your congregation. You can give them rides to the ICE offices in Milwaukee. But how do you deal with the systemic problems that are there in the first place? The systemic injustice. And in my mind, this is the opinion of Jim Coakley, it's a system that's just set up to prey on the most vulnerable in our society and frankly use them as pawns. Now, you know, I've been around 50-some years on this, in this country, mostly in the upper Midwest. And I know that there was this huge waves of immigrants from Central America and most recently from Mexico. And I know that, yes, we had laws on the books that you're supposed to do it a specific way, but I also know that everybody looked the other way. Because we needed all these workers to work at our meat packing plants and in our hotels and in our fast food places. And so we were just fine having them come in. In fact, I guess there's 10 million now undocumented workers that have come in. And we were cool with that. So it makes you wonder, what's the real law? Is it what's on the books or what we really enforce? So they're vulnerable, of course, to all kinds of things, all kinds of abuses, wage theft, violence, rape, because they're never going to report it. They're not going to go to the police. So you've set up this system to have a population permanently in your society that's practically invisible and can be preyed upon at any moment. And then what really made me angry is now we think about it with the economy at full employment, and the current government takes a lot of credit for that. We suddenly, and we have a worker scarcity. I heard this summer that they couldn't get workers to work in a lot of the resorts up north. So suddenly we have a big immigration problem, and we need to crack down on it. It just doesn't make any sense with me. So obviously, to me at least, the current government policies are just a racist attempt to score points with an ultra-right base and get reelected. And then the family that I prayed over took the brunt of that policy and got hit hard. So what can you do? What can you do? I guess you try to get a different government elected. And talk about, so we all know about the lack of voter participation. And I had all kinds of stuff in here, and if you want to stay for an hour, I could have talked about what my research was. But I decided, you know, I even had personal examples. I have 2 relatives who didn't vote. Partly one of them got kerfuffled with getting an absentee ballot, and one of them, I think, just thought the outcome was going to be a shoo-in and didn't bother. And I talked after the election at work. I used to work for Kimberly-Clark with a lot of people, and their kids, their 20-somethings, didn't vote because a lot of them were Bernie supporters and felt that they had been wronged and just stayed out of the polls. So there was a lot of reasons why there wasn't voter participation in the last election. But we all know that Wisconsin ended up being a critical linchpin in the current government's win. And we do know that a lot of, there was historically, I've heard it, I didn't research this, I heard it quoted, historically low turnout of minorities in the Milwaukee area. And so some have said, well, there was just a lackluster appeal of the candidates on both sides to that population. But then we also know that we have the strictest voter ID laws in the country in Wisconsin. And I did look this up. They said that easily it affected 12,000 people, at least students that showed up. And it was even on public radio this morning, actually, that walked away because they found they couldn't vote. And they assumed statewide it's probably up to maybe 45,000. So the solution then, is it to work on voter participation? And I know many of you are going to be out canvassing the weekend before the vote, and I know many of you have worked on voter registration efforts and that kind of thing. So bless you, bless you. So then I stop and think, and so I assume then if more people voted, we wouldn't have extreme politics towards vulnerable populations. I don't know, this kind of got me in a cycle. And I got to tell you, I had trouble writing this sermon this week because I kept thinking about it, getting caught in this cycle of pain and anger and action and then despair and trying to come out of it. So I started thinking about things like, is voting just another form of pulling babies from the river? Do I really think that I matter in this huge and complex democracy of ours? Or is there something really greater at stake here? How am I supposed to think about this as a Unitarian Universalist? I am a minister after all. And then I thought about the fifth principle. So when I set this topic for this sermon, I wanted it to be sanctuary because it's the theme I'm preaching on this month, but to me it was very closely tied to the election that's coming up in our fifth principle, which is uplifting the right of conscience in the democratic process. Now, I've never given much thought to the fifth principle. I thought, yeah, it just means we vote for things instead of having a pope or a bishop or somebody decide stuff. And then I came across the words of the Reverend Parisa Parsa, and I wanted to unpack that with you today, where she talks about the fifth principle, upholding the right of conscience in the democratic process. So if you go back to the reading that I had a minute ago, she's kind of talking about this dual concept of faith and doubt. You have to have doubt to have faith, or the dark side of the other, and then democracy and alienation. And so the way she unpacks this, she starts with faith and doubt as synonymous with our right of conscience. And I don't even know really what that means if you think about it. So this was helpful. She starts with a phrase from a minister, A. Powell Davies. He was an activist Unitarian Universalist minister in the mid-20th century. And A. Powell Davies describes conscience as, quote, the sight of the soul. The sight of the soul. So in her mind, Parsa's mind, she says that there's ultimate meaning there inside all of us. Something inside, call it God, call it spirit of life, call it your Buddha nature, call it a moral essence. Something that's universally human and deeply hidden, these are her words, that yearns to move toward greater insight and wholeness. That's why it's the sight of the soul. You kind of have this yearning and you're looking for insight. I think that's what we say when we're looking for deeper meaning. What's the meaning of life? What happens after I die? Why am I here? It's the sight of the soul. And Parsa talks about that, laddering it up into faith. It says it's our inner point of connection to guide us when our world becomes broken and we experience the deep pain of unfairness and the inhumane. And she says it's the place where we must return and nourish if our conscience, our soul, our faith is to flourish. And frankly, that's why we come here every Sunday morning. That's why I've attended Sunday morning services my whole life. I need that hour to think about my soul and nourish it. But then she goes on to say, ours is not a faith where it's just between me and my God, or me and my priest, or me and my pastor, or something like that. We are a communal faith. Everything we do is in relationship with each other. Joys and concerns we share with each other. We hold it with each other. So she said, this is the same. And this is another quote from her. She said, my connection with the sacred is only as precious as my willingness to acknowledge the same connection in others. In other words, I have this sight of the soul in me, but it doesn't really work. And it's not really a sacred thing unless I acknowledge that all of you have a sight of soul in you. So she says that there needs to be a trust here, a trust in the development of each individual conscience, both that the development's possible and that there's a commitment or a will to develop it. And she finishes by saying it's a commitment to the value of each person. So basically where I translate this, it's all kind of heady stuff. I translate it into this. We have a fervent belief in the inherent goodness of all. That's part of our universalist theology, our heritage. We didn't believe in hellfire and damnation and the selection of the few. We believe that everyone is saved. And the right of conscience means that we each have the right to determine the meaning of life, to determine what's true, and that I believe that given a real choice and a good understanding of the choices, we always prefer fairness and kindness. And this is why we come together, to constantly reinforce that doubt. Because you see what goes on in society this week, and it's a great example, and you begin to lose the doubt and hope in the fairness of the world. And we come together to support that. So I personally have no doubt, and therefore my Unitarian Universalist faith is renewed and encourages me on. Well then, Parsa goes on to do this paradox between democracy and alienation. And here she grabs a quote from another famous theologian, Unitarian theologian, Reverend Theodore Parker. And the quote is, "Democracy means not, I am as good as you, but you are as good as I am." I'm not as good as you. I am as good as you is not what it means, but you are as good as I am. She talks about the trust required in healthy and functioning democracies. And she goes out there, and this is where it gets to be kind of risky. There's a contradiction between the freedom of the ego and the freedom of conscience. The ego wants to stomp away when it doesn't get its own way because it has the freedom to do so. When your candidate doesn't win, you choose to just alienate yourself from the whole process. The freedom of conscience means we have made a commitment to value each other. You are as good as I am, and therefore we have an accountability to be in community, even if we disagree. She ends with this quote, "In a healthy community, each individual among us should occasionally be in the minority. The experience promotes spiritual growth, maturity, and a deepened understanding of the costs and rewards of community." But ultimately, in a democracy, we have to believe that everyone matters. It's that leap of faith again. And then she goes on to say, if you believe in democracy and those lofty principles and goals and abstraction, she says the act of voting is where democracy is made real, and the connection between the tangible and the abstract is made visible. That's where the rubber hits the road. And I find great hope, actually, in Reverend Parsa's closing words on this subject. She says, voting, as the shorthand for taking interest in and ownership of the process by which we as a community live our faith and choose to use our collective power to shape our world in accordance with that faith, voting is a sacrament. May we guard and protect our democratic process and deepen and strengthen our individual consciences, bound by the commitments of our faith, so that we all might grow into greater union with the divine, unquote. So for me, it comes full circle. It comes back to that opening chant for the participants of my sanctuary prayer service, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Those are wonderful words of comfort for that faith community. But Reverend Parsa has brought it back to the divine in a Unitarian Universalist way. May we lift up our fifth principle of freedom of conscience and our fervent belief that no one is alienated from the democratic process, and thereby grow into greater union with that which is greater than ourselves and ultimately leads towards justice. Amen. Amen. And I did want to say, for congregational response, I'm going to invite, I'll ring the gong at 20 after 11.